and then share the PowerPoint. All right, we've done the 6 lessons with John, and then I've done 5 previous lessons. And then tonight we're looking at chapter 20. Next week we look at chapters 21 and 22. And I've titled tonight's lesson, Old Scores Are Settled. And next week's lesson will be, What Will Heaven Be Like? All right, so I'm not going to deal much with the premillennial view of the millennium in verses 4 through 6. We had a messianic prophecy class earlier in the year, and I spent a session dealing with dispensational premillennialism. I'll simply say tonight that that theory is shot full of holes. And with a difficult apocalyptic passage, it's easier to shoot down a false interpretation than it is to make a better one fly. And tonight, I really want to get to the heart of what the passage does say, as opposed to focusing too much attention on what it does not teach. So we will try tonight not just to offer a better alternative to the premillennial view, but to really represent what the text is saying. I'm not going to suggest that that is an entirely easy proposition, but nonetheless, we're dealing with old scores being settled throughout chapter 20. In chapters 17 and 18, the harlot that Hal Lindsey calls Scarlet O'Harlot has been destroyed. At the end of chapter 19, the earth beast and the sea beast, the sea beast and the earth beast or false prophet, are cast into the lake of fire. Now in chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, you have the forces of heaven going after the mastermind himself. And let me get a volunteer for the first 3 verses, chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. Reading.
Angel down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain, and he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended, and after that he must be released for a little while.
Okay, I don't know that the angels that John saw in Revelation have wings in every case. This is a pretty good, cool picture. He has the key, he has the chain, and he's going after Satan himself. And so, again, I guess I should preface all of this also with the idea that I'm going to give you a broad overview of chapter 20, not an exhaustive commentary on every phrase or every verse. And in the broad overview, you have the binding of Satan in verses 1 through 3. You have the millennial reign in verses 4 through 6. You have a final battle of Gog and Magog in verses 7 through 10. And you have final judgment in verses 11 through 15. So the binding of Satan, you have this angel holding the key, holding a great chain. The key is to what the text calls either a bottomless pit or the abyss. It could be translated either way. He seizes the dragon, the ancient serpent that was introduced to us in chapter 12, Satan. He's also identified as the devil and Satan, bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into this abyss or bottomless pit, shut it up, sealed it, so that he might not do one thing, and that is deceive the nations any longer. A couple of really important points. After the 1,000 years ends, he's released, and we pick that up again in verse 7 for one final titanic battle. So the abyss, the bottomless pit, and the time frame, 1,000 years. Figurative or literal, physical or spiritual. Inasmuch as when we're dealing with apocalyptic language, I think it's the better part of wisdom to be a little bit cautious and to stand back and look at the big picture rather than looking at this as a description that we could quantify with our five senses within the range of everything we know on planet Earth to be apparent with our five senses, since we're dealing with spiritual realities, apocalyptic symbols. The bottom line here is the binding of Satan represents his inability to do something that he has done very well in the context of this book. And that is to deceive the nations, which, whether you're dealing with chapter 13, verse 7, verse 14, chapter 18, verse 23, chapter 19, verse 20, chapter 20, verse 3, or chapter 20, verse 8, the deception of the nations has a very targeted and specific application in this book of compulsory emperor worship or a frontal assault on the church for non-compliance with that compulsory worship. Satan will be bound so that he'll no longer be able to deceive the nations to attempt a wipeout of the church. And so, for the moment, I would say if we were to suspend judgment as to the precise, literal application of all of this, acknowledging that there are spiritual realities about which we know very little, will there ever be a time before the second coming of Christ at the end of the world in which Satan is rendered completely powerless and completely impotent in every sense? Verse 3 plainly states that there is a considerable world population which would otherwise be susceptible to the attacks of Satan. These nations are vulnerable to a future deception in verse 7 and following. And so they are distinguished from the conquerors who have proved themselves impervious to these attacks. So the impression, I believe, is confirmed by the twice repeated statement that the victors are to reign with Christ, which would be an empty recognition if it includes the promise earlier on in the letters to the seven churches that they would rule the nations with a rod of iron along with Jesus Christ. Would be an empty recognition if they were to reign over a world in which they were the sole inhabitants. So whatever battles have been fought, the end of world history has not yet come. For the nations as a whole continue to survive the millennium and beyond the millennium. However you define the millennium. Satan's deception of the nations then, in my view, now put on hold, applies specifically to the frontal assault on the church that is the main issue in this book. In other words, he will deceive the nations no more in the sense that he has done so in the context of this book. He's bound, and as far as these Christians are concerned in the first century, Jesus wins, Satan loses, he's chained, put in his place for 1,000 years. In other words, enough time that he will no longer be a threat, as he has been in the same sense in which that threat manifests itself in this book. He's chained, he's put in his place, and it makes perfect sense in the context of the book, if you just stay in that context, that whatever reality, spiritual or symbolic, are not necessarily an absolute restriction in physical terms, in the sense that Satan has completely lost his ability over demons to tempt people, or his demons can no longer tempt people and wreak havoc in this world, even if he happens to be bound for a long, long time in some sense. The fact is that he is bound here. And so there are some restrictions put on him. He is curtailed. He's like a dog on a chain, if you will. And so there will be no more one world empire threats to the church's existence through Satan's deception during the aftermath of this victory in this era. I don't believe that means forever, because verses 7 through 10 envision a future uprising beyond the 1,000 years. So I don't take it in an absolute sense. Ironically, there's a parallel to the binding of Satan for 1,000 years and the reigning of saints for 1,000 years. And so this millennial reign seems to coincide with the binding of Satan for this 1,000-year millennium. And let me have a volunteer to read that, verses 4 through 6.
Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand, and they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years.
Okay. Again, we're in a minefield of interpretation here. And again, I'll issue another caution. And that is the trouble with being too dogmatic about exact historical correlations is that apocalyptic language breaks all the rules of space and time, and there are visionary previews in sequential, but not necessarily chronological order. So we have a preview of the future, or an actual event in the present, or from our perspective, the past, with a wide panoramic, with close-ups. And at the end of chapter 2 and at the end of chapter 3, the Lord promises Thyatira and Laodicea that there'll be opportunity for victorious Christians who conquer to reign with him, to rule the nations with the rod of iron, to sit on the throne, because they have overcome just as he has overcome. And so one of the difficulties in Revelation, and this is, I believe it's the main difficulty, is you've got earthly symbols and you have heavenly realities side by side, forming big cosmic pictures. And so I'm not always sure where to differentiate between a spiritual symbol and a heavenly reality. I believe the 1,000 years is figurative for a long, 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 long time. In light of the symbolic numbers used in the book, you've got 144,000. You have the 3.5 years, 1,260 months. Those are figurative numbers, I believe. And I believe this is another one, representative of a long, long time. But I'm going to give you two views that are not necessarily mutually exclusive. One I'll call the spiritual symbol view, and the other I'll call the heavenly reality view. And I don't believe that they're necessarily mutually exclusive. There may be some seeds of truth in both views. And so I understand chapter 20 to bring to an end of tribulation at the beginning of church history. And then verses 7 through 10, the millennium ends, and then you have another big cosmic battle described in verses 7 through 10. And so two Herculean conflicts separated by 1,000 years, again, that I would take symbolically or figuratively. But just to very quickly return to the idea that I don't see a premillennial outline here. There's no pre-tribulation rapture. There's no second coming of Christ. There's no millennial reign on earth. This is in heaven. There's no literal Jerusalem on earth here, land of Israel. Even the beheaded souls are resurrected souls. You could hypothetically argue, at least, that we're not even talking about resurrected bodies, but souls of people who literally lost their heads because they're martyrs for Christ. And the warning of the book is don't add, don't take away. No tampering, no additions, no deletions, no alterations of any sort. And if we stick to that and we look at what the book says for itself, then we're in safer territory. But in any case, you have beheaded souls who are now raised in some sense, reigning with Christ for 1,000 years. And this picture, you have the four living creatures, 24 elders around the throne. We've seen them in chapter 4 and 5. And then you have these additional beheaded souls who are reigning with Christ. So I'm going to give you two views. And you can think about this and regurgitate it in your mind somewhat and see what you think. Spiritual symbol view. This was taught me by Farrell Jenkins when I was a student at Florida College, going through a Revelation class. You have a scene of apparent defeat in Revelation 6, 9 through 11, where souls underneath the altar are crying for justice. They're crying for vengeance. And Satan is still on the loose. They're under the altar. Their unavenged blood must wait a little while longer till the rest of their brothers join them. And God brings a culmination to all of this. Well, you have the opposite picture in chapter 20, where resurrected souls are given judgment. Satan is no longer on the loose. He's bound. They're no longer under an altar. They're on thrones. And their unavenged blood now is avenged. They have triumphant reign and new life. So it's a picture of defeat gives way to a picture of victory. And for first century Christians, they would take solace in the knowledge that our side is going to win, even if I don't know how this plays out in exact ways in this life. I know that in the end, in the context of eternity, the good guys win, the bad guys lose. And as far as even the current conflict, God will bring it to an end, and the church and the forces of God will be victorious. I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's kind of an idealistic picture. But to me, it's a little bit unsatisfying. And I think leaves me a little bit empty in this regard. Because I'll give you the other view, the heavenly reality view. And that is that there actually is some reality to saints being transported to heaven to share in the reign and rule of Christ while life is still going on earth. In other words, you have these heaven-sent calamities, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of wrath, and even those 2 witnesses that are the Moses-Elijah figure of chapter 11, they have power to smite the earth with every plague. And you have this heaven-sent bombardment of Christ ruling the nations with a rod of iron. After this titanic battle is over, this view says that saints are transported to heaven and are now going to share with Christ in this kind of activity while life still goes on earth. Purpose of the judgments was to induce repentance. And this view says or suggests that saints now reign with Christ literally. That Jesus has gone to glory, chapter 1, verse 5 and 18. Well, so have they. Those 2 martyrs are resurrected and transported. It's kind of like the Star Trek, beam me up, Scotty. They are transported directly to heaven. And that seems to me, the promise of Jesus is he has come to life, but so have they. He rules the nations with a rod of iron, but his promise in those letters to the 7 churches is you will share with me in this. And ironically, in chapter 4, when John has these visions and you see the 24 elders, and many of the commentaries will take the 24 elders as a picture of the 12 patriarchs in the Old Testament and the 12 apostles in the New Testament, equaling 24 elders of both testaments, who are alive and well and sitting on thrones and casting their crowns before him and having bowls of incense, which represent the prayers of the saints. All this going on while saints are still alive on planet Earth. If we have no problem with 24 elders being around the throne, why would we have a problem with martyred saints being around the perimeter of that throne or sharing the reign of Christ in some way during a vast stretch of church history? It would be dying and going on to be with the Lord, as Paul says in Philippians 1. Again, I'm throwing that out, and I'm not going to answer this for you. I want you to think about it. But it would be the idea that in some literal way, saints are transported to heaven before the end of time to share in the glory of Christ and the rule of Christ over this world. I've asked you to read Revelation and to put a bunch of time element indicators down, and I've got a whole series of those time element indicators in the book of Revelation. But I think the most important ones, so far as this conflict is concerned, is this. These things would shortly come to pass, and then all of this would be launched. Then there would be a great conflict, and it would last a figurative 1,260 days, 3.5 years, or 3.5 times, which is a symbolic short period of time, relatively speaking. And then the enemies would be overthrown, chapter 18, 19, 20. Satan would be bound 1,000 years. I don't take that 1,000 years literally, nor do I take the 3.5 years literally, but in relative terms, the conflict is going to be short, and the binding of Satan then long, and the millennial reign long. And there'll be this triumphant reign beyond this immediate conflict. And so I may not know exactly when the 1,000 years ends, but I'm fairly confident when it begins. It begins after a short conflict that occurs very imminently after the book is produced and published. These things will shortly come to pass. The conflict comes, it lasts a short time, and then Satan is bound a long time. In relative terms, the binding of Satan is many multiples, many times over the duration of the conflict itself. And that effect, symbolically speaking, you got a short time and then you got a long time. And that's intentional, I think, even if it's symbolic. So here's the thing. Beyond the millennium, which may stand roughly for the whole of church history, you have this final battle. And it mirrors the battle you read about in Joel 3 at the Valley of Jehoshaphat, or in Ezekiel 38, 39, the battle of Gog and Magog, as Ezekiel represents it. So let me get a volunteer for chapter 27 through 10.
I can read that. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison. I will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up and over the broad plain of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever.
Okay. Again, we could spend a lot of time on this, looking at Joel 3, looking at Ezekiel 38, 39. We don't have that kind of time. So I would encourage you to take a hard look at passages like that in the Old Testament that are precursors of this. But as I understand this, there's this final globalist battle, the nations versus the church. Satan deceives the nations, and you have a sequence of events. The millennium ends, Satan is released, he deceives the nations, he gathers them for battle, where you have this vast army versus the saints that are described as a camp and a beloved city. Incidentally, the beloved city, in my view, is the church. And I believe that's true here. Fire from heaven consumes Satan's army. The devil is thrown into the lake of fire. That should be lake of fire. It's a typo. To be tormented forever and ever. And so if you've got a conflict of the church versus the beast in the first century, that's not the last one. That's the first one. So I'll throw out again two interpretations. And I don't think they necessarily are mutually exclusive, but I'll throw them out for your thoughtful consideration. One is that verses 7 through 10 represents an archetype, representative of additional conflicts in other times, in other places. What you're about to experience in Asia Minor, for example, is the first of many. But for you, Satan will be bound 1,000 years, but there'll be other battles down through church history, other times when saints are mercilessly persecuted, and they'll have to win just like you have won. Or, and again, I don't believe this rules out what I've just said necessarily, one monster battle at the end of time. So that Satan deceives the nations once again for a frontal assault on the church. And if I were preaching on this, I would say beware of globalist visions of utopia especially if they involve propaganda, forced compliance, social control that might have an ungodly spin to it, in which Christians are made a target. Won't be the first time that's happened on the earth, in which all the peoples of the earth tried to unite in a way that would compete against God's agenda. So again, if I were preaching on this, I would say, don't believe everything. Satan comes out to deceive the nations. Don't be a victim. And there may be human agendas that we need to be mindful of, but the most insidious agenda of all is Satan's agenda. And again, the goal here is the defeat of God and the church. So the idea in verses 7 through 10, whether you're talking about an archetypal thing where you got other times, other places where this plays out again and again and again, or one final uprising beyond 1,000 years, beyond, say that the 1,000 years roughly equates to church history, one final hurrah in which Satan musters a universal force against the decided minority of the faithful who are just a camp, just a beloved city. Are they totally vulnerable and defenseless? May seem so. But no matter how great the assault, no matter how bleak things may seem for God's people, we have the one who rules the nations with the rod of iron on our side. And that doesn't stop. So the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. And again, the lesson is the same for first century saints. It's for 21st century saints, or whenever saints are challenged to be faithful unto death so that we receive the crown of life. But in this battle, heaven's arsenal is once again deployed. There's fire from heaven. Satan is not only bound for 1,000 years, in this case, he's thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and tormented day and night forever and ever and ever. So what verses 7 through 10 represents, I believe, is that the monster conflict that first century saints faced is not the last one. It's just the first. And that this plays out again, and maybe again and again. But I wouldn't be averse from the idea that if the church began its existence in the first century with a monster conflict, that the church, right before the end of time, has another monster conflict. And that would make Revelation extremely practical and relevant to saints of all ages, ready at any time, at any place, anywhere, but cognizant of the fact that no matter what, God's people win. So maybe a summation of church history in which you have a monster conflict at the beginning and a monster conflict at the end, maybe archetypal where you have many conflicts and other times, other places. I'll leave you to chew on that and think about it on your own. But then we have final judgment. Let me get a volunteer for verses 11 through 15.
I'll do that. I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire.
Okay. We're going to look at chapters 21 and 22 next week. And I do believe that is a description of God's people in heaven. And I do so for a couple of reasons. Actually, 3 or 4 or 5 reasons. But when you look at the letters to the 7 churches and the promises made to the 7 churches, including the idea to the church in Philadelphia that they would be a pillar in the temple of God, and Jesus would write on the name of that pillar, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven. That's a future reality as far as the church in Pergamum was concerned. And as is all of these promises that hearken back to fulfillment in chapters 21 and 22. There are a lot of things said in chapters 2 and 3 that are not yet fulfilled. And you read about them in chapters 21 and 22. And the second thing that is decisive for me is that even though apocalyptic language breaks a lot of rules of space and time, there is a sequence of events here. You do have shortly to come to pass. You do have a short conflict. You do have a millennial reign. You have one final hurrah of Satan, and then you have final judgment. And chapter 21 and 22, in my view, are beyond the final judgment. And so there are a lot of, and I got some other reasons, but those are the 2 biggies for me that put this in the context of our heavenly home as opposed to the church on earth. Even though there are many brethren that hold that view, and these are things that we ought to think about and not necessarily argue about endlessly. But you have this final judgment. The books are open. Another book is open, which is the book of life. And if anyone's name is not found written in the book, he is cast into this lake of fire, and it's a horrifying picture. And so what I want to do in the remaining time, I'm going to give you a choice of two things. I've got some pictures of the cloisters apocalypse from the medieval ages, a lot of pictures of the book of Revelation that are really cool. And I could show you some of those pictures. Or if anybody has questions or comments, we can deal with those questions or comments. So I'm going to open it up for questions or comments because I think that's more important. But if anyone has a question, I may not be able to answer it. I've thrown out some options, and I have done the best I can with a big picture of chapter 20. I'm sure I haven't answered everybody's questions, but if you have a question or a comment, feel free to make that or to ask. Okay, I'm going to share a cloisters apocalypse. Okay, this was early 14th century, early 1300s. Let me unshare this one. I'm going to. Okay, and I'm going to try to share this again. Okay. That's Jesus, the sword coming out of his mouth, chapter 1. Burnished bronze feet and John falling down. The 7 lampstands, you see those? This is, this is medieval, but it's also in some ways a representation of those are the 7 churches of Asia. They look. I can't say that that's not colored with medieval. And here you have the living creatures and 24 elders, and John on the left side enters the door into heaven with a book in his hand. He's going to record these things. And the Lamb, 7 eyes, 7 spirits of God, and again, the 4 living creatures, 24 elders, and John is on the right side with the book in his hand, observing this. And then you have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in chapter 5 or 6. Okay, my computer is skipping a little bit. Souls underneath. This is the end of chapter 6, where people are crawling into the rocks and the crevices, saying, "Hide us from the wrath of the Lamb." And you have beheaded souls, angels holding heads, and I guess that's the 7 trumpets, and the trumpets are sounding, and the plagues are going forth on the earth. I think the previous one was the wormwood. That might be John eating the book out of the angel's hand. Those are the 2 witnesses that are eventually put to death in chapter 11. And here they're transported up into heaven. And then the trumpet sounds. That's probably the end of the 7th trumpet in chapter 11. Okay, this is chapter 12. You've got the woman and the sun and the stars and the dragon. And she escapes to the wilderness and is given wings to fly away from the wrath of the dragon. And then you have the sea beast emerging, chapter 13. And again, John on the left side recording this as pretty cool for a medieval book. And then the people are worshiping the beast. Authority is given to the beast so that people will worship the beast. And he has authority to make war against the saints. And then the earth beast is urging people to worship the sea beast. And if they don't, they are attacked. And then you have the Lamb slain on Mount Zion in chapter 14, and the 144,000, and then the great multitude of people from every nation, and so on. I think our time is about up, and so let's call it quits. But I thought those were pretty neat to look at. All right, heaven next week, chapters 21 and 22. Solomon? Yeah, could you press the recording off if it's not done?